Well, good morning. The subject of our lecture this morning is on the United States of America. We've treated in turn England and France and Germany, and you should have a sense by now of the sweeping philosophical, literary, industrial, political movements. And I am of the impression, it's a controversial impression in the academy, but I'm of the impression that America is somewhat unique. Um, not, okay, Otto von Bismarck, who was the Chancellor of Germany in the late 19th century, had a saying that God has a special providence for drunks, fools, and the United States of America, right? So when we talk about American exceptionalism, we have this idea of special providence, that God has granted to America this kind of uniqueness. And we can certainly put that on the table and discuss that this week. I'm not sure that's what I'm arguing. I mean, I do believe that God has a destiny for nations as well as persons, but I think that destiny is pretty hard to understand historically. So I'm not trying to make an argument about that. I just think as a social scientist that if you look at the data, you'll see all of these ways in which the United States is unique. And it's a uniqueness that provides a kind of shaping to the 21st century world that we live in today. So be looking for ways to understand that uniqueness, right? Now we're talking about the United States in a Victorian age when we approach the 1830s and start to talk about the issue of liberalism and slavery. We should say a word about Victoria. Queen Victoria reigned in England from the mid-1830s till I think 1903. This is the golden century in British history. So if Britain in the 19th century has this sort of world empire, and America and the end of the 20th century has this sort of world empire, there's some parallels. Part of what makes America so interesting is that in some ways it's more Victorian than England. That the things that are really powerful in England are even more true in America. And so one of the things I want you to sort of play around with this semester is that there's an Anglo-American exceptionalism. There are patterns of development of political and moral philosophy, ideas in literature that seem especially true in America and run counter to the trends on the continent. We really saw that with the French and American Revolution, right? But if you want to understand America, we've got to go back a bit and go back to the kind of the very founding of America. Now, this is a broad brush. It's painful for me to kind of do this so quickly. The themes that you're going to get here are really themes from about 2.5 courses that I teach. But hopefully your appetite will be whet and you'll say, hey, I might want to take one of these courses in the future. Okay. The first thing I want you to understand, when you understand America, is that there are a diverse set of religious origins that make America culturally unique. Most of these are British, but they're not entirely British, right? The first and most important cultural influence is a religious influence from the American Puritans. Now, we tend to think about the Puritans as being dour, sour, and depressed, as some people who don't really know how to have a good time. But in fact, the Puritans were a dynamic religious movement that created churches, that created towns. There were about, I think, 30,000 Puritans that came in the early 17th century, and they settled and they were successful and they spread. So if you live in the American Northeast, like the space where Houghton is, there's a good chance that if not your DNA from Ancestry.com, your culture is very much influenced by the world of the Puritans, right? Think about what it is about the Puritans that really makes America like England. Well, one of the things is that the Puritans settled in nucleated towns. They settled in these little villages around a green that looks a lot like Houghton's Quad. There was a kind of maybe 100 little houses around this green. They shared a church. They shared a common legal system, and they generally met together every year or more than once a year to have elections, to have court meetings. Um, and they practice something that looks a little bit like direct democracy. And as a kid who grew up in Vermont, I remember experiencing this as a young man, that every year the town would actually gather in our school gymnasium, as it turned out, and debate issues like who the selectman is going to be for the next year, who is going to run the town, how much water should be released over the dam that year. And it was a kind of fresh direct democracy. Now this was happening in Massachusetts in the 1640s, and it would have been completely unheard of anyway, right? The one thing that I think really sets America apart from England is that this Puritan society, because it was a religious project designed to sort of give ultra Protestants who wanted to purify the Church of England the chance to set up a perfect Protestant society in America. They believed that everyone ought to read and write. In part so that they could read the Bible. The Education Act of the Puritans wasn't No Child Left Behind. It was called the Old Deluder Satan Act. It was basically based on the assumption that the devil is roaring around like a lion looking for someone to devour. And so every child needs to learn how to read and write. The Old Deluder Satan Act specified that every town with more than 50 families needed to set up a school whereby all of the children would learn to read and write. If with more than 100 families, they needed to set up a preparatory school where the boys could learn Greek and Latin so that they could then go to the university, which was Harvard University, which is where you would train the clergy, right? This is an intensely Protestant society, and that distinguish it that much from England, but in England, these matters were controversial. It's also an intensely middle-class society, because when they distributed the land, they made sure that everyone who settled here got family farms of at least about 100 acres. And so where in England, maybe 5% of the families had that much land. In the Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, probably 70% of families have that much land. And it creates a remarkably egalitarian middle-class society, right? So we call it a yeoman society. And this is a different kind of place. That middle-class framing is so crucial to the way America understood itself. Now, but this is just one set of colonies. The southern set of colonies is organized along a very different line, right? The southern colonies were settled by Virginia gentlemen, the second sons of generally English nobility. They don't settle in towns. They settle in plantations scattered along the waterside. Now, initially, this is a society that's organized around servant labor and indentured labor, and all of the labor is generally English. I know the New York Times has made a great deal of the origins of slavery in America in 1619, which is when the first slave ship showed up. But frankly, slavery was a tiny fraction of American labor, really until the 1670s. The first 2 or 3 generations in Virginia set up the planter class, they set up this aristocratic elite, and then they set up a system of white servitude underneath of it. So this is a society that's actually a lot more like England, and it's a lot less exceptional in terms of its class system. But this is also a society that's a lot more entrepreneurial. The people who come to America come to get rich here, and so America's kind of exuberant capitalism might be said to be born in Virginia rather than in Massachusetts. Now this is all based on the farming of tobacco, which was its lucrative cash crop, and which would allow a gentleman who came to get, the servants don't get land. For every slave or servant the gentleman brings, they get 50 acres of land. And so the gentleman would establish these thousands of acre plantations and grow phenomenally rich for themselves. And see how the settlement is spread out along the river. So this is a dispersed settlement rather than town. And this means that the planters sort of a law unto themselves. As you're reading in Frederick Douglass this week, pay attention to the way the plantation works as an institution of American development and capitalism. The third kind of place where you see settlement are the middle colonies, and we get different values in America from the middle colonies. We get the Quaker ethos. The Quakers were radical Protestants. They believed in radical equality, but it wasn't the equality of revolution because the Quakers were pacifists. They had humble origins. Very few of them came from wealth. William Penn was the exception. And when they came, they migrated to America generally as poor artisans, and they got to work. This is an industrial, humble lot. The Quakers refused to take oaths. They refused to accept service in the military. They were pacifists. They were radical kind of New Testament Christians. And so they were wildly persecuted in England. And when they came to America, they set up a system of civil liberties here so that no one would be treated, the criminally accused wouldn't be treated of crimes in a persecuting fashion. Crimes were punished violently in the South. In the North, they tended to be punished with shame, like scarlet letter, or, you know, the communities would turn on people that they thought were evil. But Penn insisted in founding Pennsylvania on due process, right? Another theme that you see in the middle colonies is this idea that the Quakers only about 13,000 of them came to America, which is just not enough to create a viable, vibrant colony. So when the Quakers came, they brought in immigrants who shared their peaceful values from all over the world. Well, not all over the world, but especially from Germany and from England. And they created what they called the Hive, or it's a social experiment, a peaceable kingdom. So these are three really different sets of values. In New England, liberty tended to be the right to be a Christian and the right to live in a well-ordered society. In the South, it tended to be the liberty of the planter to make a lot of money, and no one was going to tell them what to do on their land. So they had a really high view of private property. And in the middle colonies, influenced by the Quakers, you tended to get this idea of reciprocity, of freedom in the middle colonies. Goes back and forth between, you know, people need to respect one another as equals. I find students generally see the Quaker idea of liberty as being the most familiar to them. Okay, so America then is diverse, right? From the beginning, you're going to see a people who share very different social and economic and religious values, right? From the beginning, probably a quarter of people who lived in British North America didn't even speak English as their first language. They might speak Swedish, or they might speak Gaelic, or they might speak German, or they might speak French. So this America is a diverse place, and that shapes it in ways that I think England doesn't. If part of what it means to be modern is cosmopolitan, well, America's had that from the get-go. Okay, the second thing that I think makes America really exceptional are a set of religious revivals led by Whitefield, Edwards, and Wesley. And you should have studied these in some ways in your Humanities 102 class if you did it. But these are especially powerful in America, right? This is part of what makes America America. I've just emphasized the incredible diversity of the American sort of colonial experience. What do they have in common? Why do they unite together to fight the British? Well, one of the things that unites them is that evangelicalism becomes powerful in each of these colonies. Jonathan Edwards preaches and does a remarkable work and is very successful in the Puritan colonies in leading them toward evangelicalism. The Scots-Irish settlers in Pennsylvania and New Jersey are very much influenced both by George Whitefield's itinerant ministry, but also by by the work of the Presbyterian revivalists who ended up founding Princeton University. Many of the Ivy League universities in America, like Brown and Princeton and Columbia, were actually founded during this period. Wesley himself comes to visit Georgia, but Whitefield does a really fine job of sort of evangelizing the southernmost of colonies. And then there's a sort of Baptist revival in the backcountry that's really powerful in North Carolina and Virginia and Pennsylvania. So America is unusually religious, and not just religious because Europe is religious, but as the Enlightenment is sort of sweeping through Germany and France, in America is becoming one of the most uniquely religious places in the world. And so this is America in the 1760s when the course starts for us, when we start talking about the precursors of the American Revolution. We're part of the British Empire. We think we're British. We have roughly British values. And then the Declaration happens. And when the Declaration happens, I think we take a decisive break with the British, right? You see here a picture of George Washington and his family. The American Revolution, as I argued, is a Republican revolution. It's a revolution rooted in government by consent. It's a revolution that prizes the value of families, that unites the diverse colonies. But and this is a paradox. This is a paradox that Frederick Douglass is going to talk about. You know, the freedom of Washington's family, in many ways, in the South, rests on the labor and the slavery of the people around them. And in the picture, the role of the slave is somewhat invisible here in this Washington family portrait. And yet, it's their labor that makes Washington's wealth possible. Now, Washington himself, it should be said, recognized the hypocrisy of his position, and so his will organized for all of his slaves to be freed on his death. Um, Most of the founders couldn't actually afford to do this. The slaves were so deeply mortgaged. And when you read Douglass, pay attention to what happens to slave families when the owner dies. Usually they're sold at auction and they're scattered, because in the same way that I don't own my own house, really, there's a bank that does it. Most planter families didn't own their own slaves. They were mortgaged to a bank. And so they had to be sold to pay debts when the patriarch died, right? But that this Republican revolution creates a passion for new values and ideas. And this was also true in France. You could also find it in Republican places in England, like the Wollstonecraft family, and the sort of the Romantics were very much taking this, right? Americans they maintained their high level of passion for education. They granted women far more autonomy and independence than in other parts of the world. Um, they create a more democratic political system. Not everyone gets the right to vote, but most people have the property that they need to vote. And so more people vote in America than anyone else in the world. And that this is a sort of, I wouldn't describe it as a Kantian republic. Um, it's a republic that prizes virtue and religion as the means to public happiness, right? And most of them are farmers. So there's some contrast with England. But the freedom that Americans possess because of the revolution allows them to open up and go in radically new directions. And this is really where America becomes exceptional, right? So nowhere else in the world do people have as much freedom as they do here to choose their own brand of Protestantism that they want to follow. You can be evangelical or you cannot. No one in the world has as much freedom to choose where you want to live as in America. If you don't like your neighbors, you could pick up stakes, you could put your stuff in a wagon, and you can head out to Kentucky. You can live where you want to live. No one in the world has as much power to choose their political leaders as in the United States of America. There's a brief experiment with Republican government in the French Revolution, and it fails in a bloodbath. And that never happens in America. The tradition of kind of choosing one's congressman and choosing one's president sustains and is still with us today. And then this is the one thing in which this is the one kind of revolutionary thing that I think Britain and America share. There's a kind of an economic revolution, right? The industrial revolution immediately starts to happen in America. So those four, and what that means in America is that, this young man, George Washington's stepson, I mean, he could choose to be a planter if he wants to, but he doesn't have to. He doesn't have to do what his parents did. He could become a lawyer. He could become a doctor. He could become a congressman. Sort of the freedom of young people to choose their own career path is something that feels very American. Whereas in other parts of the world, I think people that are blue collar generally feel like they're supposed to do what their parents did, right? You sort of inherit, and for thousands of years it had been that way. Well, not in America, right? That's what freedom means here. And those things conspire to make America, I think, unlike the rest of the world in the level of freedom that we espouse, all right? But then there are some things that, contradictions, tensions in the system, right? Because we value freedom so much, and yet there are millions of slaves living in bondage, and the lucrative character of both first tobacco and then cotton in the American South means that this becomes economically very difficult to displace, right? Frederick Douglass is going to argue the contradiction between human rights and slavery. People are slow to see it because of their economic self-interest, right? The America is also sort of a nation of craftsmen early on. You don't see a lot of industrialism, in part because British economic laws had required manufacturing to happen in England before the Revolution, right? So you've got thousands of cobblers and barrel makers and blacksmiths in America, people who have the tools to become industrialists. But there's a pretty significant lag in America because of colonialism, right? And then the westward movement, right? What we're talking about is sort of British values. There's really an epicenter, and it tends to be in that space between Quaker Philadelphia, which prized hard work, and Puritan Boston. So the Northeast is an especially kind of capitalist, economically vibrant place after the Revolution. And the South sort of gets stuck in the slave model. And it's actually far more developed than, say, France or Germany and Russia. Don't exaggerate the backwardness of the South. But America is sort of caught up in this tension that will, I think, only finally be resolved by the Civil War. All right? And then just kind of moving briefly over the next not 100 years, but 70 years, right? These things that already made America unique, they intensify. So in the early 19th century, there's another set of religious revivals, especially led by Charles Finney. There are these missionaries from American seminaries, from Williams College, from Andover, from Yale, that kind of go out all over the world and they tell natives in Oregon about the gospel, they tell them in Hawaii about the gospel, they go to Burma and India and China. But then they also go into the American West, which is a largely unchurched place, right? And they go to Kentucky, and there's religious meetings in Kentucky, these sets of revivals where 20,000 people are evangelized. It's kind of a stunning thing. Now, the epicenter of this is this space where we live here around what was the Erie Canal. I mean, it's still there, but we don't use it that much, right? And this was called the Burned Over District. It was called where we are Houghton. And Houghton is where Houghton is, in the middle of nowhere. At least it feels like that to me. Because this was the seat of kind of Wesleyan religious revivalism, of people who believed that sin ought to be removed from not just personal life, but from American society. So there's this part of what makes America unique is this set of revivals where there are these moral reformers who are on this crusade. I mean, it might be a women's rights crusade, it might be an abolitionist crusade, it might be a crusade to remove alcohol. And that word crusade is actually really rich in American Protestantism. Today, in the age of kind of the struggles against Islamic terror, crusade has these really dark overtones that remind us of the Middle Ages. But in the 19th century, these were generally seen as moral crusades, right? And so you see some of that in England. It's intensely true in America, and it's especially intensely true here in the Northeast. You see the rapid development of the market revolution in America, right? And in part because there is less entrenched privilege here, this takes place really fast. Most of the major innovations are British, but they develop rapidly, and by 1900, by 1840, the nation is pretty well connected by roads and canals. And then by the 1860, in the north is pretty well connected by railroads, right? So we talked about this in the industrialism lecture on England, but just like England is knit together by about 1830 into a single market. And then the Navy sort of begins to unite the British Empire into a single market. This happens in America. It's a huge part of American pride. This might be the source of American nationalism when we talk about nationalism, right? It's not rooted in a military experience. It's not rooted in empire. It's rooted in sort of liberal economic development, right? And part of this is connected to something that the Americans are unusually good at, which is sort of entrepreneurship and innovation, right? There's all of this really interesting content when you study the English Revolution about, the English Industrial Revolution, about how it depends on agriculture, right? Well, in America, this develops really fast, right? John Deere develops a steel plow in the 1830s. Actually, I think it's the 1790s that allows you to move through difficult soil very fast. It allows increases in yield. Cyrus McCormick invents this reaper that you see there, where 2 men with a horse and the machine could do the work that 40 men would have taken earlier. And especially in the North, where slavery is illegal, there's this push for labor-saving devices, this push for productivity, and all of that farm productivity means that if 2 people can do the work of 40 people, then there's room for 30 people to be working in New York City or in Buffalo or Rochester, right? And these inventions are about more than just agriculture, right? Goodyear in America figures out how to vulcanize rubber and make it available for all kinds of industrial applications. Samuel F.B. Morse invents the telegraph. And look at these numbers from the U.S. Patent Office, right? So patents had been rare before 1811, but this culture of invention becomes dominant in America by the 1850s. So the Patent Office is seeing filings of over 2,000 patents a year by the 1850s. And the patent sort of becomes, there's something uniquely American. Well, why would you invent something? Well, you'd invent something because you imagine that there'd be some gain. There's this restless acquisitiveness. There's this individualism that's prized in America. All right? And so you see the development here of North over South. This is especially true in the North. I think in the South, Douglas is describing a world in which kind of development happens more slowly. So pay attention to what Douglas describes. What impact does slavery have on society? I'll be sure to ask you about that. Right? Another thing that begins to happen that radically reshapes the world is that Richard Hofstadter is a historian of the United States, and he had this saying, America was born in the country and moves to the city. America, born in the country and moves to the city. But the America that's born in the countryside, this is a European countryside, and in many cases peasants from failing Irish farms, or from Poland, or from Slovenia, or from Germany, or from Spain, or from Norway, leave their places and they move to American cities, right? And this was pretty muted before 1830. And then in the 1840s, there are over 1.7 million people who come, many of them Irish, but some of them from the failed revolutions in Germany. And in the 1850s, you get 2.6 million. And this is a complicated story. Many of the migrants see themselves as having tremendous opportunity in America, right? And this is especially a place where you see Quaker tolerance become a dominant American value, right? You come here, you fit into a Republican political system, but as long as you're willing to participate in the Republican political system, small r Republican, right, government by consent, then you would have the capacity to improve yourself, to grow, to become a capitalist, to become an entrepreneur, to gain land, to acquire property, and to better yourself and your family through self-improvement in the American education system. Now, this is a world in which ethnic difference is far more pronounced than it is today, right? So if you come from an Italian-American family or an Irish-American family, you probably see yourself as being white in America, and you imagine yourself as being on the other side of the debate in, say, the Black Lives Matter debate. In the 1840s, you would have seen yourself as being not very white at all. In fact, you would have seen yourself as being an almost racial other. And this was sort of recognized that America before the Civil War was a place where there were gradations and where you could actually economically really improve yourself. But especially in the East Coast and places like New York and Boston, there was a lot of prejudice against Irish people and Italian people, right? Actually read this letter once, it sort of blew my mind. There was a letter from, not a letter, but an interview with a slave. And the slave was asked in the South by a journalist, well, how are you treated? Oh, and the slave said, oh, I'm treated very badly. My master beats me as if I were a common Irishman. This is sort of understanding that the Irish and the African American was sort of on the bottom of the level in America, and they were in deep rivalry. And in fact, the Irish actually frequently hated the African American as the person who was, so they by kind of really despise. They learned that if you despise the African, then that sort of makes you into somehow more American. So there's a twisted side to this, and there's an opportunistic side to this. And this is the sort of paradox of America, that American slavery and American freedom are bound up with one another. Now, I'm not convinced that America is inherently racist from birth. In that sense, I don't buy the 1619 product that the Times is running. I really feel like, I think that this is something that America learns, and it's different in different places, right? So in the space in New York where we are, there was the profound influence of Wesleyan revivalism, and abolition was really strong here. And you could go to a place like Southern Ohio, where slavery had always been illegal, and yet there was still this tremendous prejudice. So when you're talking about America, resist the urge to generalize. It's actually quite messy and quite complicated, right? And so if you look here, part of the story then in America is this intense urbanization story. You see the chart here, sort of mapping, right? I'm going to jump back and jump forward. No, it's gone. There's that rapid development. America's a rural country in 1800. It's industrializing in the Northeast by 1860, and by 1920, America's an essentially urban country. And that's a story of modernization, and it's happening all over the West. So as you're thinking about what is America unique, is America exceptional or not, much of this story happens kind of globally. And I think there are really two things that are unique in America. There's American religiosity, there's American Republican values, our political system, But then connected to that, I guess this is a third source of uniqueness. It's negative uniqueness, which is the institution of slavery, which doesn't look anything like us anywhere else in the world. All right, and so it's to slavery that we turn when we talk about Frederick Douglass. I jumped over a couple of slides because I think we're moving we need to wrap this up. But back to this question of American Victorianism, right? There's a sense in which, and this is what I find so wonderful about America, right? The American liberal tradition, by which I don't mean kind of the contemporary Democratic Party and the America of Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden, right? The American liberal tradition of the 19th century, of John Stuart Mill's in England, of Kant in Germany, right? That prizes individual moral self-improvement. This was an America that made itself available to people who were very, very privileged, but also people who were very much not, right? And that opportunity-oriented society, I think, is the secret to understanding 19th century America. That moving from a kind of a newly independent colony in 1800 to the largest industrial power in the world in 1900. So look at the people here. I mean, you've got people of privilege, right? In the upper column here, this is Harriet Beecher Stowe, who comes from a prominent New England family and who had an access to education that women frequently didn't have. And yet she wrote this book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, that sort of inspired America to think about the violence in the institution of slavery, right? This man here is John Ross. John Ross is Cherokee, right? Native American from the South, and yet he worked tirelessly to create a farming society for the Cherokee, to create an alphabet, to create a Cherokee constitution. He discovered to his horror that many Southerners sort of raised on slavery were unwilling to accept the Native American as their equal. But one of the two major American political parties, the Whigs, were willing to support him in this text. This was a deeply divisive political issue in the 1830s, right? As divisive as Black Lives Matter is today. And one of the factions in American politics basically said that the Cherokee deserved to be treated as people with community rights and land rights and property rights, just like anyone else in American society. Right? John Marshall, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, actually wrote a pair of Supreme Court opinions defending the right of the Cherokee to live on their land and to be protected by rights under the Constitution. Jan Andrew Jackson kind of refused to accept the decision and have the Cherokee relocated out to Oklahoma. And then there are sort of people who would have considered themselves maybe Victorian, people like John C. Calhoun, who were ardent racists and who would assume that no, these are privileges only for the white. So this is a hotly contested issue. How far does equality go? How far does opportunity go? Right? But so this is there's some tensions here. In my mind, two of the most Victorian of Americans are these two men, Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. Douglass is asking you as you're reading, am I not a man? Am I not an individual? Am I not a slave? The hinge point of the book is when Douglass realizes that he's been brainwashed and that in fact he is fully human. He's entitled to every right in the Declaration of Independence. So one of the questions I want to talk about this week is how does he come to this realization? Focus on that question, right? But I see Lincoln also. Lincoln doesn't come from privilege. He comes from utter poverty in Kentucky and is a rail splitter and a salesman and then a self-educated lawyer. Lincoln gets a year and a half of education, and yet the opportunity of America allows him to sort of become something more and catapult into something more. You can ask me about Martin Van Buren. There's an application, but I just want to wrap this up. So, all right. So I'm going to stop there. We could talk a lot about slavery, and I could do a whole background lecture on slavery, but I think the best way to learn about slavery is to just read Frederick Douglass and ask yourself that question. I'm really interested in the way in which slavery and the institution oppresses the African American, but I'm also really interested in the way in which Frederick Douglass learns how to become free. That tension between slavery and freedom is what I want to talk about this week, all right? So this is a shorter lecture, but you'll have a little more time to do reading. And we'll stop here. And if you've got questions, you can send me an email.